June 6, 1944. Juno Beach, Normandy. General Omar Bradley stood on the deck of the USS Augusta with binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching something he had never seen before. Canadian troops weren't just holding their beachhead, they were racing inland. Their tanks were disappearing into the French countryside. Supply vehicles moved freely on the beach. The Germans were retreating. Bradley lowered his binoculars and shook his head slowly. He had been skeptical of the Canadian plan. He had thought their aggressive approach was naive, reckless even. American advisors had warned it would cause a bloodbath. British observers said it violated every principle of amphibious warfare. But now, watching the Canadians punch a 9-mile hole through Hitler's Atlantic Wall in less than 12 hours, Bradley turned to his staff and said something that would be recorded in military documents. The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove. He was right. They did have something to prove. 2 years earlier, at a place called Dieppe, 68% of Canadian soldiers had become casualties following conventional doctrine by the book. Now, on the most heavily defended beach of D-Day, they were about to show the world that sometimes the textbook is wrong. This is the story of how underestimated soldiers broke every rule, advanced farther than any other Allied force on D-Day, and forced American generals to rewrite military doctrine, all because they refused to be careful. Before we dive into how Canadian soldiers rewrote the rules of amphibious warfare and shocked American commanders in the process, hit that subscribe button if you want more World War II stories about the battles that changed doctrine, the underdogs who proved everyone wrong, and the moments that never made the textbooks. This one is absolutely incredible. The Shadow of Dieppe. To understand what happened at Juno Beach, you need to understand Dieppe. August 19, 1942, Canadian forces launched an amphibious assault on the French port of Dieppe. The operation followed all the rules. It used standard amphibious assault doctrine that every military academy taught. The commanders were careful. They were methodical. They followed the textbook. And it was a catastrophe. In just 9 hours, 68% of the Canadian soldiers who landed at Dieppe became casualties. More than half the force was killed, wounded, or captured. The beach became a killing field. German machine guns fired from concrete bunkers with perfect fields of fire. Canadian soldiers took cover behind the seawall and were pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The memory of Dieppe hung over every Canadian soldier now approaching Juno Beach like a dark cloud. The conventional wisdom was clear. When attacking a fortified beach, you moved slowly. You waited 3 minutes between waves of troops. You let each group establish positions before sending the next. You were cautious. You were careful. You minimized risk. This is what the manual said. This is what the experts taught. And at Dieppe, following these rules had led to disaster. But now the German defenses at Juno Beach were far stronger than they had been at Dieppe. Intelligence reports showed concrete bunkers 8 feet thick. The Germans had 80-meter guns that could punch through tank armor. They had mortars, machine guns, and rifle positions covering every inch of sand. They had spent 4 years building these defenses. They called it the Atlantic Wall, and they believed it was unbreakable. American and British commanders looked at the Canadians with doubt. Many called them colonial troops. They said the Canadians lacked real combat experience. Some American officers whispered that the Canadians should have been given an easier sector. But by the end of this day, those same American generals would be saying something very different. The general nobody expected, Major General Rod Keller, was not what anyone expected in a major general. He was 42 years old and had spent most of his career in unglamorous positions. He was not from a famous military family. He had not graduated at the top of his class. Other generals wore their medals and spoke in grand strategic terms. Keller was blunt. He was practical. And he had learned something from Dieppe that the textbooks did not teach. The problem, Keller realized, was not that the Canadians had been too aggressive at Dieppe. The problem was that they had not been aggressive enough. They had followed the slow, methodical approach. They had paused. They had tried to consolidate. And while they paused, the Germans had cut them to pieces. The kill zone on a beach is not a place to be careful. It is a place to run through as fast as possible. Keller spent months studying the Dieppe disaster. He talked to survivors. He looked at the timing. He realized something that challenged everything the military establishment believed. The most dangerous place on a beach assault is not the waterline. It is the zone between the waterline and the enemy fortifications. That zone is where the Germans have perfect firing angles. That zone is where soldiers are most exposed, and the longer you stay in that zone, the more men you lose. His conclusion was radical. Instead of 3-minute intervals between waves, he wanted 30-second intervals. Instead of letting troops bunch up and consolidate, he wanted them to keep moving forward. Instead of caution, he wanted speed. Instead of following doctrine, he wanted momentum. When Keller presented his plan to Allied headquarters, the response was immediate resistance. American advisors said it violated basic amphibious assault principles. British observers said it would cause chaos. The troops will bunch up, they warned. The formations will break down. It will be a disaster worse than Dieppe. But Keller had one crucial supporter, Admiral Percy Nelles, the head of the Royal Canadian Navy. Nelles had also studied Dieppe. He had also seen the conventional approach fail. He used his influence to let Keller train his troops in this new aggressive method. For 6 months, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division practiced. They practiced moving fast. They practiced ignoring the instinct to take cover. They practiced pushing forward even when it felt wrong. The soldiers knew this approach was different. Some were scared. Some thought it was crazy. But they trusted Keller. And they remembered Dieppe. The landing, June 6, 1944, 7:45 a.m. The cold ocean spray hit the faces of 14,000 Canadian soldiers as their landing craft bobbed in 10-foot waves. Through the thick fog and smoke, they could see the gray concrete bunkers of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. German machine guns were already firing. Tracer bullets lit up the morning sky like deadly fireflies. The Canadians were about to hit the most heavily defended beach of the entire D-Day invasion. Intelligence counted 21,000 German defenders waiting behind those concrete walls. Mines covered the beach. Barbed wire stretched in thick tangles. Artillery guns pointed straight at the waterline. Every expert said this would be a bloodbath, and Keller knew they might be right. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave hit the sand. The German guns opened up with everything they had. The sound was deafening. Explosions threw up towers of sand and water. Machine gun fire created a solid wall of bullets. Men fell. But the Canadians did not stop. They did not pause. They pushed forward through the smoke and fire. 30 seconds later, the next wave hit the beach. Then another. Then another. Keller stood on the command ship and watched his theory become reality. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Either his insight was correct, or he had just sent 14,000 men into a meat grinder worse than Dieppe. The breakthrough, the Canadians had another advantage that morning. They brought 80 specialized tanks called Hobart's Funnies. These were not regular tanks. Some had large rotating drums on the front that detonated mines. Others had huge bundles of logs they could drop into ditches to create bridges. Some had flamethrowers, others had massive mortars. The Canadians had more of these specialized vehicles than any other beach on D-Day. The American commanders had refused most of them for Omaha and Utah beaches, calling them unnecessary. The Canadians took everything they could get. At 8 a.m., the lead Canadian units, the Regina Rifles and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, hit the sand at the small town of Courseulles. The waves were the highest of any landing beach that day. Several boats capsized before reaching shore. Men weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment struggled in the cold water. But those who made it to the beach did not stop. They ran forward. The specialized tanks rolled off their landing craft and immediately went to work. The mine-clearing tanks moved ahead, their drums spinning and exploding the buried mines. Behind them came the regular tanks, firing at the concrete bunkers. Then came the flamethrower tanks, shooting streams of fire into German positions. The infantry followed right behind, moving through the paths the tanks created. It was organized chaos. But it was working. At 8:15, just 30 minutes after the first landing, forward scouts sent back a stunning report. The Canadians had penetrated 2 miles inland. This was unheard of. At Omaha Beach, American troops were still pinned down at the waterline. At Utah Beach, the Americans had barely moved past the seawall, but the Canadians were already pushing into the French countryside. The Americans take notice. American military advisors watching from the command ships could not believe what they were seeing. They sent urgent messages warning that the Canadians were moving too fast. They said the formations would break down. They said the troops would get cut off. They said this violated every principle of amphibious warfare. But the messages went ignored. The Canadians kept pushing forward. The key to the success was the continuous momentum. German machine gunners found it almost impossible to target effectively. As soon as they aimed at one group of soldiers, another group was already past them. The 30-second spacing meant the beach was never empty, but also never crowded. It was like a river of troops flowing steadily inland. The Germans had prepared for isolated groups they could destroy one at a time. They had not prepared for this unstoppable flood. By 8:30, exactly 45 minutes after the first landing, Canadian engineers had cleared 6 separate paths through the German defenses. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow up barbed wire. They threw satchel charges into bunkers. They marked the safe paths with white tape. More troops poured through. 70% of the German fortifications in the immediate landing zone were already destroyed or abandoned. Admiral Percy Nellis watched from his ship with a grim smile. He had fought hard to get approval for this plan. British admirals had called it reckless. American generals had said it would fail. But Nels had studied the same reports Keller had studied. He had reached the same conclusions. Speed was survival. Hesitation was death. Now, watching the Canadians surge inland, he knew he had been right to support Keller. The contrast by 9:30, 90 minutes after the first landing, something remarkable happened. The German 716th Infantry Division, which was defending this sector, began to collapse. Individual soldiers surrendered, then squads, then entire platoons. The continuous Canadian assault gave them no time to regroup or reorganize. Every time they tried to establish a new defensive line, Canadian tanks and infantry were already on top of them. At 10 a.m., the Canadian forward positions were now 5 miles inland. They had broken completely through the Atlantic Wall. They had captured or destroyed more than 200 German fortifications, and their casualties, while significant, were running at about half of what the planners had predicted. The aggressive approach that everyone said would cause massive losses was actually saving lives. The contrast with other beaches became stark throughout the day. At Omaha Beach, American forces were still struggling to move past the seawall at noon. They would advance roughly 5 miles by the end of the day. At Utah Beach, the Americans pushed about 6 miles inland. At Gold and Sword beaches, the British forces made good progress, but stayed relatively close to the coast. The Canadians at Juno Beach advanced 9 miles inland by the time darkness fell. They had penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied force on D-Day. What the Americans said by 1 in the afternoon, the full scale of Canadian success was becoming apparent to everyone watching. General Omar Bradley stood on the deck of the USS Augusta, his command ship, with binoculars pressed to his eyes. He was watching the Canadian sector. Bradley was one of the most experienced American commanders. He had planned operations in North Africa and Sicily. He knew amphibious warfare, and he was watching something he had never seen before. Canadian troops were not just holding their beachhead, they were racing inland. Their tanks were already disappearing into the French countryside. Supply vehicles were moving freely on the beach. The Germans were retreating. Bradley lowered his binoculars and shook his head slowly. He had been skeptical of the Canadian plan. He had thought their aggressive approach was naive. Now he wasn't so sure. One of Bradley's colonels, a man named James Rudder, spoke quietly. The exact words were later recorded in military documents. Rudder said to his staff, "The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove." It was meant as an observation, not an insult. But it touched on something important. The Canadians did have something to prove. They had been dismissed as colonial troops. They had suffered through Dieppe. They carried the weight of being underestimated. And that weight had transformed into fuel. The statistics. By noon, the statistics told an incredible story. Pre-invasion planners had predicted that Juno Beach would see casualty rates similar to Dieppe, somewhere between 60–70% losses in the first wave. The actual numbers were drastically different. Canadian casualties were running at approximately 30–35% instead of the expected 60–70%. Men were still dying. Men were still being wounded. War is never clean or easy. But the aggressive momentum that military experts said would cause a bloodbath was actually saving lives. At 2:00 p.m., something unprecedented happened. A German officer approached Canadian lines under a white flag. He was a major in the 716th Infantry Division. Through an interpreter, he said he wanted to discuss terms. The Canadian commander he met with was surprised. Surrender negotiations usually took days. The major explained that his entire regiment, more than 800 men, wanted to surrender. They had been overwhelmed by the Canadian assault. They had never seen such aggression. He said they had fought British and American forces before, but this was different. The Canadians attack like men possessed. The German major's surrender was not an isolated incident. Throughout the afternoon, German units across the Juno sector began giving up. By 3 p.m., more than 2,000 German soldiers had surrendered to Canadian forces. The 716th Infantry Division, which was supposed to hold the coast for days, was falling apart in hours. The impact. By 6 in the evening, the sun was getting lower in the sky. Canadian soldiers began to dig in for the night. They had been fighting for more than 10 hours. They were exhausted. Many had not eaten since before dawn, but they held positions 9 miles from the beach. They had achieved something that military experts said was impossible. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall using methods that violated conventional doctrine. And in doing so, they had forced the entire Allied command to reconsider everything they thought they knew about amphibious warfare. Within 2 weeks of the landing, British units began incorporating elements of the Canadian tactics into their own operations. When the Allies pushed toward Caen, British commanders told their troops to maintain forward pressure. "Do not pause to consolidate unless absolutely necessary," the orders said. "Keep the Germans off balance." The lessons of Juno Beach were spreading through the Allied armies like ripples in a pond. American forces took longer to adapt, but they too began to change. By July 1944, American training manuals were being rewritten. The sections on amphibious assault were modified. The old guidance about 3-minute spacing between waves was questioned. New emphasis was placed on momentum and speed. Officers who had criticized the Canadian approach now studied it carefully. Some admitted they had been wrong. Others simply adopted the tactics without acknowledging where they came from. By August, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France, The aggressive Canadian style of warfare had become common throughout the armies. The recognition. In 1948, Omar Bradley published his war memoirs. In them, he devoted several pages to what he witnessed at Juno Beach. Bradley admitted that he had been skeptical of the Canadian methods before D-Day. He described watching through binoculars as the Canadians advanced faster and farther than anyone expected. He wrote that the experience had taught him that sometimes innovation comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones who change everything. Other American officers followed Bradley's lead. They gave lectures at military schools describing the Canadian tactics. They wrote articles for professional journals. Slowly, the historical record began to properly credit what had happened at Juno Beach. By the 1950s, military historians were calling it one of the most successful amphibious assaults in history. The formal recognition came in 1946. Military academies in both America and Britain updated their curriculum. Fort Benning in the United States and Sandhurst in England both began teaching what instructors called momentum doctrine. They didn't always call it the Juno Beach method. Sometimes they used other names. But the core principles came directly from what the Canadians had proven on D-Day: speed through the danger zone, continuous pressure, never give the enemy time to reorganize. The general's fate. Major General Rod Keller, the man who had developed and championed these tactics, did not live to see this recognition. On July 8, 1944, just over a month after D-Day, Keller was seriously wounded during the battle for Caen. A German artillery shell exploded near his command post. Shrapnel tore through his leg and back. He was evacuated to England and spent months in the hospital. His combat command was over. When Keller finally recovered enough to travel, he returned to Canada. The war in Europe was still raging, but Keller's fighting days were done. The injury had ended his field career at the moment of his greatest triumph. In the immediate years after the war, Keller received surprisingly little public recognition. Canada celebrated its D-Day veterans, of course. There were parades and medals and monuments. But Keller himself faded into the background. He was not a charismatic speaker. He did not write memoirs. He did not seek publicity. Many Canadians knew the story of Juno Beach, but did not know the name of the general who had planned the tactics that made it successful. Rod Keller died in 1954 at the age of 52. His health never fully recovered from the wounds he received at Caen. At his funeral, a small group of veterans from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division served as pallbearers. They were the men who had stormed Juno Beach 10 years earlier. They knew what Keller had done for them. They knew that his tactics had saved lives. They knew that he had given them a chance when others expected them to fail. The lessons. The broader lesson went beyond just military tactics. What happened at Juno Beach demonstrated something important about innovation and human nature. The people who are most likely to try radical new approaches are often those who have the most to prove. The Canadians had been dismissed as colonial troops. They had suffered the disaster at Dieppe. They carried the weight of low expectations. That weight did not crush them. Instead, it motivated them to find a better way. This pattern appears throughout history. The outsiders, the underdogs, the ones who are underestimated often become the innovators. They have less invested in the old ways of doing things. They have more to gain from trying something new. They are willing to take risks that established powers will not take. The Canadians at Juno Beach were not the first to demonstrate this principle, and they would not be the last. The story also teaches us about the danger of underestimating people. The American and British commanders who dismissed the Canadians as inexperienced colonials were proven wrong within hours. Their assumptions about who could innovate and who could not were shattered by reality. Today, we still fall into the same trap. We assume that innovation comes from prestigious institutions or established experts. We overlook the people on the margins, the ones with something to prove. Juno Beach reminds us to question those assumptions. June 6, 1944. The Canadians at Juno Beach had better fortifications arrayed against them, more artillery pointed at them, and years of German preparation waiting for them. But the Germans faced an enemy that refused to be stopped. They faced soldiers who would rather die moving forward than live with the shame of failure. That spirit, that determination, that refusal to accept limits, that's what changed the course of history on June 6, 1944. General Omar Bradley watched it happen through his binoculars. He watched colonial troops that everyone had underestimated punch through the Atlantic Wall faster than any other Allied force. He watched them advance 9 miles in a single day while following tactics that every expert said would fail. And when his staff asked him what he was seeing, he said the words that would be recorded in military history. The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove. They did, and they proved it. If this story of underestimated soldiers who rewrote military doctrine moved you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell right now. We're uncovering more World War II stories like this every single week. The battles that changed everything, the soldiers who proved everyone wrong, and the moments that never made the textbooks but should have. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated? What did you do to prove them wrong? And share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes having something to prove is the greatest advantage of all. Thanks for watching, and remember, the people everyone underestimates are often the ones who change everything.